You mentioned that three of them elope, and it's another significant attribute of the book that there are several ménages à trois in it. There's Shelleys with Mary and her stepsister. There's also Leigh Hunt's with his wife and her sister. And the whole idea of free love is clearly one that's in the air and being hotly debated.
Yes, that's quite true. The phrase free love is in fact something which doesn't really get used about the group or about this mode of behaviour until much later in the 19th century. But you can see in something like Shelley's Notes to Queen Mab that the idea that people should throw aside the sort of constricting boundaries of social convention is something which someone like Shelley is trying to live out in his own life. So at the heart of the story I tell are these two families, Shelley and Mary and Claire, and Hunt and Marianne and Bess. The symmetry between those two groups really interests me because there are two ways of looking at the group. One is that you can put Shelley and Hunt at the centre, in which case you get a story about poetry and political idealism and a story about creativity. Or you can put Claire and Bess at the centre, at which point you get a much darker story about the consequences of some of those ideas. And I've tried to move between those four axes to sort of draw out some of the complexities. But it seems clear that for Hunt, for example, it's more complicated with the Shelleys, but for Hunt, Marianne and Bess come to represent very different things. So Marianne is a sort of figure of his private hearth, his fireside, things which are very, very important to him, important to his politics and his poetry, as I've said. But Bess is a sort of public, someone via whom he can engage with the world. She accompanies him to parties and she negotiates with his publishers. So it's as if the public and private that he needs in his life are represented by the two of them in separate ways. With Shelley and Mary and Claire, it's much more complicated, partly because the relationships between all three of them are somehow much more contested and much more difficult, and they change much more. And there is, of course, a huge complication that in the spring of 1816, Claire becomes pregnant by Byron.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard not to draw the conclusion that free love in an era where there was no reliable contraception and where medicine was very rudimentary wasn't such a blessing for women.
That's certainly true. Claire talks in her 70s to a man called Edward Silsby when she's living in Florence, and so that's how we know quite a lot of the things that she thought about her past, because he wrote them all down. And Silsby records Claire saying at one point that Mary, during the spring of 1815, came into her room crying and said, "Shelley wants me to sleep with Hogg. He says that Beaumont and Fletcher had one mistress." So there's a moment there where we can see some of the consequences that you're talking about free love. And it's certainly true that the women have unwanted pregnancies and illegitimate children and feel the consequences much more acutely. And that results in the case of Fanny Imlay, Mary Shelley's half-sister, and Harriet Westbrook, Shelley's wife, in suicide. Having said that, though, I do think that it's important to understand the decisions that Mary and Claire take in particular in the context of their desire for independence. So Claire sees that by running off with Shelley and by separating herself from her family unit, Mary essentially manages to make for herself an independent life, with a family and a home, and then this writing that begins. So I think we have to look at Claire's decision to throw herself at Byron, not just as sort of an example of female victimhood, but as an act which she self-consciously engages in order to try and win her own independence, to put herself at the centre of her story, rather than to continue being a kind of hanger-on in Mary and Shelley's story.
Now, I suppose one particular period when you see this sociability and creativity in action is the famous summer of 1816, where Byron and Shelley and Mary and various other people were in a villa on Lake Geneva. What did you want to bring to your account of this quite famous summer?
You're quite right, it's extremely famous. It's been written about many times before. And it's very famous partly because they were all there and partly because it's the summer in which Mary Shelley starts Frankenstein. There are two things really that I wanted to bring to my account. One of which is that the chains of intellectual allegiance that develop there are really, really striking. So people often write about it, but I wanted to write about it in terms of what happens to Byron's third canto of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, in which he says later to someone, he says that in that summer Shelley dosed me with Wordsworth's physic, even to nausea. So I wanted to bring to the fore the way in which being with Shelley and being in Geneva has a real impact on Byron's poetry, an impact you can actually see if you look at the different drafts of his manuscripts. The second thing I wanted to do is I wanted to write about Frankenstein. I wanted to write about this collaborative moment when, out of An Evening of Ghost Stories, Mary Shelley conceives the idea for Frankenstein, a novel which she subsequently writes and then Shelley edits. Because the story of the creation of Frankenstein has often been told in the past in terms of either patriarchal oppression, so Shelley imposes his views on his wife's manuscript and it's an act of domination, or it's been told in a story about co-authorship. Frankenstein's only good because Shelley got his act together and rewrote it. I wanted to suggest that the collaborative engagement between Shelley and Mary on that novel is much more equitable and much more engaged and incisive, and that it tells us something about romantic sociability and about romantic collaboration, which is that it really works, and that in fact that shows both of them at their best, editing each other's work, understanding each other's work, talking about each other's work. So I wanted, in my account of that summer, to reposition Frankenstein as a sort of celebration of sociability and collaboration in the way it's written and in the way Mary Shelley subsequently positions it, rather than as a contested document and novel.